As the bustling crowd flowed easily through the airport immigration counters, Amara Johnson clutched her passport tightly, her heart steady, believing she was just another traveler returning home after a long journey. But the illusion shattered. The moment she stepped forward to the desk, the white immigration officer barely glanced at the smiling couple ahead of her before waving them through without a single question. Yet when his cold blue eyes fell on Amara, his expression twisted into suspicion. He didn't greet her, didn't even acknowledge her as a person. He simply snatched her documents from her hand as if she were already guilty of something. "Step aside," he barked, his voice cutting through the air loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, and in that instant, Amara felt every iron line turn toward her. Confused but compliant, she obeyed, watching with disbelief as person after person, all of them white, passed easily through the checkpoint, while she remained singled out. The officer's questions came sharp, relentless, and laced with venom. "Where are you really from? Who bought your ticket? What are you hiding?" His tone wasn't about protocol, it was about power. About stripping her dignity in front of strangers who now whispered and stared, their judgment piercing her like knives. Amara's voice trembled as she answered, her words dismissed, her explanations mocked, her accent ridiculed. He held her passport up as if it were fake, flipping through it with exaggerated disgust, then slammed it down on the counter with a smirk. "These documents don't look right," he muttered loudly, ensuring everyone could hear, planting seeds of doubt that she didn't belong here. Amara's chest tightened, her palms sweating, her knees weak, as the humiliation spread like fire through her veins. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was treated worse than a criminal, surrounded by stares that stripped away her humanity. The officer leaned in close, his voice low but venomous. "People like you don't just travel without reason. You think you belong here, but you don't." His words slashed deeper than any interrogation, each syllable dripping with the poison of centuries-old prejudice. Amara felt trapped, her dignity crushed under the weight of his authority, her hope shrinking as the line of passengers grew longer and her shame more unbearable. She wanted to scream, to fight, to demand respect, but her throat closed, her body frozen in the cage of powerlessness. The crowd shifted uneasily, but no one stepped forward. No one dared to challenge the officer, and the silence of their complicity screamed louder than the insults hurled at her. Minutes stretched into an eternity, every tick of the clock another reminder that her freedom, her humanity, her very existence, was being questioned. She had walked into the airport with confidence, but now she stood there, broken, humiliated, and utterly alone. And as the officer smirked, signaling for another guard to approach, Amara realized this was no routine check, it was an attack on who she was, a test of whether she would crumble under the weight of hate. Her heart pounded, her mind raced, and a single, haunting question echoed in her soul. Would she ever walk out of this airport free, or would her skin color condemn her to chains she could not escape? Amara Johnson had always been the kind of woman who carried herself with quiet strength. The kind of strength that came not from loud declarations or fiery speeches, but from the simple dignity with which she lived her life every single day. She was 32, an accomplished project manager for an international non-profit that provided educational resources to underprivileged communities. And she had just returned from a 2-week conference in Europe, where she had spoken passionately about equal access to education, standing before hundreds of academics, professionals, and government officials. Amara had been confident, articulate, and respected. But as she made her way through the gleaming corridors of the international airport on her way back home, rolling her small carry-on bag behind her, she felt a sense of exhaustion washing over her, not just from the flight, but from the weight she always carried. The invisible burden of being a black woman navigating a world where her very presence was too often met with doubt, suspicion, or disdain. Airports, in particular, had always made her uneasy. It wasn't just the chaos of the crowds, the tight security, or the endless lines. It was the memory of small moments, each one etched in her mind like scars. The time a customs officer had questioned her 3 times longer than anyone else in line. The time she had been asked if she spoke English, despite being born and raised in Chicago. The time a flight attendant had assumed she was in the wrong seat in business class. Each experience was brushed off by others as just a mistake or standard procedure. But Amara knew better. She knew the difference between a mistake and a pattern. And the pattern was always the same. Her blackness was the first thing people saw, and for many, it was the only thing that mattered. Still, Amara told herself to breathe as she approached the immigration hall. The terminal was buzzing with travelers dragging their suitcases, families reuniting with hugs and laughter, and businessmen tapping impatiently at their phones. Overhead, the hum of announcements in multiple languages filled the air, and beyond. The glass walls, airplanes, gleamed beneath the floodlights of the runway. Amara adjusted her blazer, smoothed down her braids, and checked her passport and boarding pass one last time. Everything was in order. She was a lawful citizen with a spotless travel record, no reason to fear, no reason to expect trouble. Yet, her chest tightened the moment she saw the row of immigration counters ahead. Manned mostly by stern-looking officers in crisp uniforms, scanning faces with a mix of indifference and scrutiny. She noticed something that made her stomach sink. How quickly passengers in front of her, most of them white, were waved through after barely a glance at their documents. The line moved briskly, almost too briskly, and Amara knew from experience that her turn would not come so easily. She tried to silence the voice in her head that whispered, "They're going to stop you. They always stop you." As she stood in line, she looked around at the faces of the people near her. There was a young white couple laughing softly with each other, their passports already tucked neatly away in their pockets after a painless check. There was a businessman with silver hair, his expression bored, his clearance so smooth it seemed automatic. And then, there was Amara standing tall, keeping her expression calm, but inside, bracing herself for the storm she felt coming. She thought of her mother's words, spoken years ago, "Baby, sometimes it doesn't matter how good you are, how smart you are, how polite you are. Some people will still only see the color of your skin." She hated that those words were true. She hated even more that they echoed so loudly now. In this place where she should have felt safe and welcome, her phone buzzed in her purse. A text from her younger brother, Marcus, lit up the screen. "Can't wait to see you, sis. Let me know when you're out. I'll be waiting at arrivals." Amara smiled faintly, her heart swelling with warmth. She couldn't wait to see him. Either she imagined their reunion, the laughter, the relief of being home. That image was the light she held onto as the line inched forward, step by step, until finally, she stood at the counter of a white officer with pale blue eyes and a jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if it were carved from stone. He didn't greet her, didn't ask how her flight was, didn't even glance at her with the casual politeness he had offered the man before her. Instead, he snatched her passport from her hand with an abruptness that made her flinch, and for the briefest moment, Amara's chest hollowed out. She knew this was the beginning of something she had feared but hoped against hope she would escape this time. She reminded herself of who she was, of her accomplishments, of her right to be here, but all of that seemed to fade in the officer's icy stare. To him, she wasn't a professional, an advocate, a citizen. She was just Black Dot. The officer flipped through her passport with deliberate slowness, his expression hardening with each page, as if looking for a reason to disbelieve her. Amara swallowed the lump in her throat, offering a polite smile, her voice steady as she said, "Is everything okay?" But he didn't answer. His silence was heavy, his pause long enough to draw glances from people in line behind her. And, in that silence, Amara felt it, the shift from being just another traveler to being a suspect. She felt the air grow colder, the space around her shrink, and the hum of the airport fade into a distant roar. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow, as she realized this was not just about documents or procedures. This was about her. This was about the color of her skin, the shape of her features. The assumptions etched into the officer's mind long before she had ever stepped into his line. And as he looked up at her at last, his gaze sharp and piercing, Amara felt the ground tilt beneath her. She didn't know exactly what he would say, but she knew what it would mean. Another battle. Another humiliation, another reminder that no matter how far she traveled, no matter what she achieved, she could never outrun the shadow of racism. Amara felt the officer's piercing eyes lingering on her far too long, the silence stretching into something oppressive, like a rope tightening around her chest, and then, without warning, he leaned forward and asked a question so sharp and loaded it seemed less about protocol and more about suspicion. "Where exactly are you coming from? And what was the purpose of your trip?" She answered calmly, her voice measured, explaining she had been at an educational conference in Europe, but his expression didn't soften. Instead, he tilted his head, squinting at her as if weighing every syllable, as though she were hiding something sinister beneath her polished tone. When he asked for proof, she showed him her conference badge and travel documents. Yet he barely glanced at them before pushing them back across the counter dismissively, muttering, "Anyone could print this off a computer." Amara felt heat creep up her neck, a quiet rage she swallowed because she knew better than to snap back. Knew better than to give him any excuse to escalate, but still, the injustice stung like acid. The white businessman before her hadn't been asked a single extra question, hadn't been forced to explain himself beyond handing over his passport. Yet here she was, on display, forced to justify her existence. The line behind her shifted impatiently, the murmurs of other travelers growing louder, and Amara wished she could disappear, wished she wasn't the only blackface at this counter, wished her skin wasn't the silent target that drew suspicion. Like a magnet, the officer's next words hit like a hammer. "Step aside, ma'am. We're going to need to conduct additional screening." Her heart sank. She glanced at the officer in the next lane, who smiled politely at the white woman. He was processing, barely scanning her passport before waving her through, and the contrast was undeniable. With every step Amara took toward the secondary inspection area, her suitcase trailing behind her like an anchor, she felt the weight of 1,000 invisible eyes. She could hear the whispers, sense the unspoken judgment. She must have done something wrong? Why else would they stop her? The room she was led into was stark, fluorescent lit, and cold. Its walls painted a sterile white that made the air feel thinner, harder to breathe. 2 more officers, both white men, stood waiting, their arms crossed, their expressions a blend of boredom and suspicion. And the sight of them made Amara's chest tighten further. The officer handed over her passport and gestured for her to sit, his tone clipped, devoid of courtesy, as though she were already guilty of some unspoken crime. Amara sat stiffly, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling, and tried to remind herself of the truth. She had nothing to hide. She had done nothing wrong. She was simply a citizen returning home. But in that moment, those facts seemed irrelevant. In that room, with those eyes on her, the truth didn't matter, because racism had already written the narrative they chose to believe. The questions came rapid-fire, invasive, and accusatory. Why had she been in Europe? Who had she met with? How could she afford the trip? Did she have anything to declare? Did she have family abroad? Each one carried the unspoken undertone that she didn't belong, that she wasn't credible, that her very presence was suspect. Amara answered each with dignity, but inside, her stomach twisted, her throat burned, and her spirit cracked a little more with each dismissive nod, each skeptical glance. When one officer asked her to unlock her phone for verification purposes, her jaw clenched. She knew this wasn't routine. She knew her privacy was being violated, but what choice did she have? Refusal would only confirm their bias, only prolong the ordeal. With shaking fingers, she entered her passcode, watching as the officer scrolled through her photos, her messages. Her private life laid bare under the pretense of security, and the humiliation felt suffocating, a violation, not just of her device, but of her dignity. The other officer unzipped her suitcase, rifling through her clothes, her neatly folded outfits, now tossed carelessly across the metal table, her belongings handled like contraband instead of the personal items of a woman who had worked hard, traveled far, and expected at least the basic courtesy of respect. She remembered the last time she had traveled with a white colleague. He had breezed through customs while she had been stopped for questioning, and later, when she mentioned it, he had shrugged and said, maybe it was random, not realizing how painful it was that he could afford to believe that, while she could not. Here it was again, not random, not isolated, but a recurring wound reopened in broad daylight. Amara's eyes stung, but she refused to let the tears fall. Refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Yet the ache in her chest grew heavier with every passing minute. She thought of her brother Marcus waiting outside arrivals, his excitement, his smile, and the image of him standing there unaware of what she was enduring in this back room made her heart ache with a loneliness so profound it nearly crushed her. After what felt like hours, though in reality it was less than an hour, the officers finally returned her passport and phone. Their demeanor, casual, almost dismissive, as though they had merely checked off a box on their list, as though the emotional wreckage they had left behind in her was of no consequence. "You're free to go," one of them said flatly. No apology, no acknowledgement of the humiliation, no recognition of the pain they had inflicted. Amara gathered her belongings in silence, her hands trembling as she refolded her clothes, her phone heavier in her palm now that it carried the memory of their intrusion, and her passport no longer a symbol of her citizenship, but a reminder that even the documents declaring her right to belong could not shield her from prejudice. As she walked out of that room and back into the bustling terminal, the sound of laughter, greetings, and the rolling of suitcases around her felt like a cruel contrast to the storm that still raged inside her. She spotted Marcus at last, his face lighting up when he saw her, his arms waving, his grin wide, but when he drew closer, his expression shifted, his smile faltering as he noticed the exhaustion etched into her face, the heaviness in her eyes. "What happened?" he asked softly, concern filling his voice, but Amara shook her head, forcing a smile, whispering, "I'll tell you later." Because how could she explain, in that moment, the depth of what had been stolen from her? How could she capture in words the way they had stripped her dignity piece by piece, reducing her to nothing more than the color of her skin? She hugged him tightly, drawing strength from his embrace. But even in that warmth, the shadow of what she had endured clung to her. Whispering the truth, she already knew that for women like her, the airport was not just a gateway to new places, but a battlefield, and every journey came with the risk of another wound. Amara had thought the worst was behind her when they told her she was free to go, but as she stepped toward the terminal exit, a sharp voice cut through the air, commanding her to stop once more. And the weight of dread dropped like a stone in her stomach. Another officer, this one younger but no less cold in his expression, motioned for her to follow him back into the inspection area, claiming there had been a flag on her documents, and though her body screamed against it, though her heart pounded in her chest, begging for escape, she obeyed, because she had no choice. Because resistance could mean detention or worse. The door slammed behind her with a hollow echo that made her skin crawl, and this time, the questions were sharper, crueler, no longer veiled in polite suspicion but dripping with accusation. "Are you sure you're really a US citizen? These documents don't look right. Did you buy this passport? Do you even belong here?" Each word sliced into her, unraveling the careful composure she had tried so hard to maintain, and she found herself stammering for the first time, her confidence cracking under the relentless assault, trying to insist on her legitimacy, trying to cling to her dignity while their laughter filled the sterile room, because, to them, her outrage was entertainment. One officer leaned in close, so close she could smell the faint taint of coffee on his breath, and whispered with mocking venom, "People like you are always hiding something. You can't fool us forever." And though his words were quiet, the poison in them screamed louder than anything she had ever heard. Her chest tightened, her vision blurred, and she could feel the tremor in her hands betraying her, exposing the fear she so desperately wanted to conceal. They demanded again to unlock her phone, scrolling deeper, this time reading her emails aloud in mocking tones, pulling up photos of her with friends, smirking as if those innocent snapshots were evidence of some grand deception. Her clothes, once again rifled through, were thrown to the floor, this time scattered in a pile like garbage, and when she reached down instinctively to gather them, the officer barked, "Leave it," his voice so sharp it cut into her spine, forcing her to freeze mid-motion, forcing her to stand still as if she were a criminal under arrest. The humiliation burned hotter than fire, a shame so raw it made her throat ache with unshed tears, yet beneath it surged a storm of anger. A fury so vast she could barely contain it, and in that clash of emotions she felt herself breaking, splintering, each piece of her dignity chipped away until she no longer recognized the woman reflected in the shiny metal table before her. She thought of her parents, of the sacrifices they had made, of the lessons they had taught her about resilience and strength. And the memory of her mother's voice saying, "Never let them make you small," echoed painfully in her mind. But here, now, in this room, she had never felt smaller, never felt so erased, so reduced to nothing more than the color of her skin and the prejudice it provoked. The officers weren't done. One of them demanded she stand against the wall, spreading her arms and legs for a physical search. And though every fiber of her being screamed in protest, though her soul writhed at the indignity, she complied. Her body stiff and trembling as gloved hands patted her down with clinical detachment, stripping the last threads of safety from her. When it was over, she stood there frozen, her arms still stretched, her breath shallow, her face wet with the tears she had finally lost control of. And the silence that followed was worse than their accusations. It was the silence of indifference, the silence of men who saw nothing wrong with what they had done, the silence that said her pain was invisible. They tossed her passport back at her, the little blue book that was supposed to symbolize belonging, landing on the floor at her feet as though it were worthless, and in that moment, staring down at it, she felt the final fracture inside her. The breaking point where fear, shame, and rage collided into something unbearable. She bent to pick it up, her fingers trembling so violently the booklet slipped once, twice, before she finally clutched it to her chest, holding it as if it were the last anchor keeping her from drowning. She wanted to scream, to demand justice, to throw their cruelty back in their faces. But her voice was gone, stolen by the hours of degradation, replaced with a hollow ache that swallowed every word before it reached her lips. When they finally told her to leave, she walked out of that room like a ghost, her steps heavy, her eyes vacant, each footfall carrying the weight of humiliation that clung to her like chains. The terminal around her seemed louder than before, brighter, filled with families laughing, travelers hurrying, announcements echoing. And yet, she felt utterly apart from it all, an outsider in her own country, a stranger in the place she had every right to call home. Marcus's face came into view, his smile faltering when he saw her disheveled clothes, her damp cheeks, the way she clutched her passport like it might be snatched from her again at any moment. And when he reached for her, she collapsed into his arms, the sob she had been holding back, tearing from her chest in a sound that was raw, primal, and filled with the anguish of every injustice she had just endured. "What did they do to you?" he whispered, his voice breaking. But Amara could only shake her head, unable to form the words, because how could she explain a pain so vast, so consuming, that it felt carved into her bones? How could she put into language the way they had stripped her humanity piece by piece, leaving her standing in that room, not as a citizen, not as a woman, but as an object of suspicion, of ridicule, of contempt? She buried her face against Marcus's shoulder, her tears soaking into his shirt. And in that embrace, a flicker of strength returned, a reminder that though they had tried to break her, she was not alone, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the ruins of her spirit, a spark of defiance still burned, whispering that her story was not over, that the battle she had just endured was not the end but the beginning of something greater, something louder, something unstoppable. As Amara sat in the quiet corner of the airport with Marcus holding her hand, the noise of travelers moving about their lives seemed distant, muted, almost unreal, as though she were caught in a separate world where time moved slower and every sound was filtered through the heaviness in her chest. And though her body was free from that interrogation room, her spirit still felt trapped there, replaying each moment of humiliation like a wound that refused to close. Yet, as the minutes passed and her breathing steadied, she realized she had a choice: to let this experience bury her in silence, or to carry it forward as fuel. A story that demanded to be told, because what had happened to her was not just about her, it was about every black traveler who had been stopped without reason, every woman who had been doubted and disrespected, every person whose humanity had been stripped away in the name of security. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that the pain she felt was not hers alone, but part of a larger, centuries-old injustice that had evolved from chains and whips to suspicion and interrogation rooms, from segregation signs to systemic gatekeeping at borders, airports, and checkpoints where whiteness was granted the benefit of the doubt and blackness was treated as a threat. Marcus squeezed her hand gently, reminding her she was not alone. And in his eyes, she saw the reflection of her own resilience. A quiet strength that told her she could transform this trauma into testimony, that she could reclaim her dignity, not by erasing what happened, but by refusing to let it be hidden. Later, as they boarded their connecting flight, Amara felt the stares of other passengers, but this time she lifted her chin. Not in arrogance, but in defiance, carrying the scars of the experience like invisible armor. Each step onto that plane, a declaration that they had tried to break her and failed. In the days and weeks that followed, the memory did not fade easily. Her sleep was restless, her trust in institutions fractured, her sense of safety shaken, but, instead of letting it silence her, she began to write, pouring her pain into words that became a mirror for others. Stories that resonated with countless voices who had endured the same treatment but had never spoken out. And in the chorus of those shared experiences, she found healing, purpose, and community. Her ordeal became a reminder that racism is not always loud or violent. Sometimes it is institutional, cloaked in procedure, disguised as protocol. And that makes it no less destructive, because when authority is used as a weapon against people of color, it chips away at the very foundation of justice and equality. And as she told her story, Amara began to ask the questions we all must confront. How many more must be humiliated before change is demanded? How many more passports must be questioned, bodies searched, and voices silenced before we admit that racism is not an accident of the past, but a disease woven into the present? She realized that silence only protects the abuser, never the abused. And so her voice became her protest, her truth became her resistance, and her survival became her victory. And here is where the impact extends beyond one woman at an airport, because Amara's story forces us, the listeners, the viewers, the witnesses, to reckon with our own role. Do we allow these injustices to continue by looking away, by excusing them as isolated incidents? Or do we stand with the Amaris of this world and say no more? Because every time we dismiss, minimize, or ignore the racism embedded in daily life, we become complicit in its survival. But every time we share, support, and speak up, we plant seeds of change that grow stronger than the hatred meant to silence them. The question is not just what happened to Amara, but what will happen next. Will her pain echo unheard? Or will it awaken in us a responsibility to demand better, to challenge systems that discriminate, to create spaces where dignity is never up for debate? The answer depends on us, on whether we let her story fade into another forgotten tale of injustice, or whether we carry it forward as a call to action. A reminder that racism is not just her fight but ours, and that until dignity is a right for all, none of us are truly free. So the next time you see someone singled out unfairly, the next time you hear silence where outrage should be, remember Amara. Remember her trembling hands clutching her passport. Remember her tears in the sterile interrogation room, and ask yourself, will I stay quiet, or will I stand up? Because her story is not just a story, it is a mirror, a challenge, and a demand, and the choice of what to do with it is now in your hands. And so, as the final echoes of Amara's ordeal at the airport settle in our minds, we are left not just with the image of a black woman humiliated in a sterile room under the cold glare of fluorescent lights, but with the truth that is far heavier to carry, because what happened to her is not an isolated misfortune, not an accident of misunderstanding, but rather a reflection of something deeply rooted and disturbingly familiar, a cycle that continues to reinvent itself across generations, where people of color, particularly black women, are forced to endure suspicion, disrespect, and humiliation, not because of anything they have done, but simply because of who they are, how they look, how they exist in spaces that were never designed to welcome them. In Amara's humiliation, we see the invisible weight that countless others carry each time they step into an airport, walk through a security checkpoint, or enter a room where authority holds the power to strip away dignity with a single glance or assumption, and we cannot look away from the reality that racism does not always announce itself with slurs or violence. Sometimes it wears the mask of procedure, hidden behind policies and clipboards, yet its sting is just as sharp and its damage just as lasting. Her story reminds us that racism thrives in silence, that it continues not just because of the ones who enforce it, but because of the many who witness it and choose to stay quiet, convincing themselves that it is not their battle, not their place to intervene, not their burden to carry. But history tells us otherwise, because silence has never protected the oppressed, only the oppressor. The power of Amara's journey lies in the fact that she did not allow herself to remain invisible. She did not let her pain dissolve into the background of daily injustices. Instead, she chose to carry it forward as testimony, as a light that exposes the shadows where prejudice hides, and in doing so she holds up a mirror to each of us, forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions about our world and our roles within it. What does it mean that in the year we live in now, a black woman with valid documents, with every right to travel, can still be reduced to tears and fear simply because someone behind a counter decided she looked suspicious? What does it say about our systems when humanity is stripped away so easily under the pretense of security or procedure? And perhaps the most piercing question of all: if it were not Amara, if it were you, your mother, your sister, your daughter, would you still dismiss it as just a routine check? Or would you finally recognize it as the injustice it is? Because, at its core, her story is not about a passport or an airport. It is about the daily battle for dignity, about the fight to exist without being questioned, doubted, or diminished simply for being black. The resolution of her journey is not in the release from the interrogation room or the eventual boarding of a plane, because the scars of humiliation cannot be erased by a boarding pass. The resolution lies in her resilience, in her refusal to let this experience define her as less than, and in her decision to tell the story so that we might see what she endured and recognize it in the countless others who endure the same. And that is where the impact becomes larger than Amara herself. Because the true measure of her story is not only what it reveals about her strength, but what it demands of us, the witnesses. Will we allow these stories to be forgotten, absorbed into the endless cycle of racial injustice, or will we carry them with us as fuel, as fire, as a call to demand change in the spaces we occupy? The airport where she was stopped is not just an airport. It is every workplace, every school, every institution where blackness is met with suspicion instead of respect. And every time we allow it to pass unchallenged, we affirm its power. But every time we speak up, every time we share, every time we refuse to let another person's dignity be stripped in silence, we weaken that power. So, as Amara walked away from that experience, scarred, but not silenced, the question remains for us who have listened, who have seen through her eyes and felt her pain: what will we do with it? Will we turn the page and move on to the next distraction? Or will we let her story linger, shaping the way we look at the systems around us, shaping the way we respond when we witness injustice unfolding in plain sight? Because the truth is, the Amara story is not just a story. It is a warning, a reflection, and a demand. It forces us to ask ourselves whether we will continue to let racism hide behind the ordinary, or whether we will finally stand and name it for what it is. And so I leave you with this: the next time you pass through an airport, or witness someone being singled out, or find yourself in a space where silence feels easier than action, remember Amara, remember the way her humanity was questioned, Remember the way her tears fell quietly while others walked by. And ask yourself, will I stay silent, or will I stand up? Because until dignity belongs to all of us, it does not truly belong to any of us. And if her story moves you, then let it move you to act. Because change does not begin in grand speeches or courtrooms, but in the small, everyday choices of people like you, people who decide that injustice anywhere is unacceptable everywhere. And if Amara could walk out of that room and choose resilience over silence, then surely the least we can do is carry her story forward, not as a memory of pain, but as a spark of purpose, a reminder that the fight against racism is not someone else's fight, it is ours, and it begins right here, with the choice you make after hearing her story. And so, Amara's journey through that airport does not end with the stamp on her passport or the opening of the gate. It ends with the weight of humiliation. The sting of being reduced to suspicion simply for the color of her skin, a reminder that racism does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers through policies, procedures, and cold stares that strip dignity away. Her story is more than a personal ordeal, is a mirror reflecting the struggles of countless black women and men who walk into spaces already judged before they speak, already labeled before they move. The resolution lies not in her release, but in her resilience, her refusal to be silenced, her choice to carry this experience forward so others might see and understand. And now, the question rests with us. Will we look away, or will we let her story stay with us, shaping how we respond to injustice when it stands before us? Because until dignity belongs to everyone, it belongs to no one, and silence is no longer an option.